One of the first mods I ever did was this front-loading NES. Now stock, the NES only has composite video, and the NES RGB mod adds RGB output to it. The only problem with the NES RGB kit is that you have to drill these annoying holes in the case. This first one is a mini DIN cable for the RGB output, the second one here is for audio, and this last thing over here is a palette selector switch. And as you can imagine, you need a special cable to get RGB out of that mini DIN connector. You can't just use the normal multi-out cable like you can with the Super Nintendo. But recently, LaserBear came out with this snap-fit multi-out connector, which allows you to use a standard Super Nintendo style multi-out cable, which you might already have if you have a Super Nintendo and an RGB cable. So let's head over to the bench, and I'm going to show you how to do that NES RGB mod in a front loader with that snap-fit multi-out. I got the NES RGB installation instructions pulled up on my phone. First step is to open up this console. Now that we have the board out, we're going to focus on desoldering the PPU, that's this big chip right here. This is pretty much the most difficult part of the installation, and I want to give you some tips to make this whole process go easier. I was watching a Voltar stream recently, and he was doing an NES RGB, and he pointed out this big kind of ground plane right here. These 4 pins right here, we're probably going to need more heat when you get to them on the PPU, so just keep that in mind for when you get to them. So let's flip the board over. Let's add some fresh solder to this side and that side of the PPU using drag soldering. All right, that's pretty good. Now those 4 pins I was talking about are on this side and the top up here. So let's start on this bottom side down here. I'm going to use my Heiko FR301 desoldering gun. One quick tip before doing this is make sure your nozzle is clean. My gun comes with this little poker thingy, so I'm just going to go ahead and run it all the way down just to clear out anything if there's anything in there before I even start. While you're doing this, you can always hold this up to the light to make sure that you can see through these holes here. And if you can, then you know pretty much that you have the solder out of those holes. All right, that's this side done. Now I'm going to start on the bottom on the left side here and work my way up. And right about here, I'm going to stop and try to find those pins that have that ground pad on the other side. And I'll give you some more tips when we get to there. Now we're up to those pins that were by that ground pad on the top. So Voltar's tip is to do a 4 count. So basically put the desoldering gun on those pins, wait for 4 count, and then use the vacuum and the desoldering gun. So let's give this first one a try. 1, 2, 3, 4. That seemed to work pretty well. Let's check it out. Yeah, pretty good. So let's keep moving. We got 3 more of those left. All right, pretty good. Now just the last 3 up here. Go ahead and look through the light, make sure that you've got all the holes. Maybe I can do a fancy trick and you can see what I'm talking about. So put my phone underneath here, and you can kind of tell how you can see through it, see through the light through those holes, versus that other chip down here where the CPU is, you can't see through it at all. So you could look through these holes with the light to see if there is no more solder in there. So we're looking good, so let's flip the board over. If everything goes well, we shouldn't have to do any prying. Holy cow, look at that. That is awesome. While I've got the desoldering iron out, I'm going to replace this big capacitor here. You just gotta rip this, like literally rip this thing off, the shield. It needs a little bit of force, but this top part comes right off. Just gonna make sure I remember which way is negative. I think there's gonna be an indicator underneath here, but I'm just gonna take the desoldering iron and so there's the negative band on the cap. Oh, that matches with that solder mask, that white solder mask right there. I'm actually going to be using a capacitor that was in an NES that was sort of a failed mod. So the legs are cut off already, but when you get yours, you might have long legs that you'll have to stick in there. Just going to get one of these legs in, and then make sure that the cap on the other side is pressed all the way forward. You won't have to do this if you're buying a cap kit, because you can just stretch the legs apart and that should tension it in place, but I gotta do what I gotta do. All right, now we got a nice new power filter cap. Let's just go ahead and put this top shield back on. Just make sure it's lined up all the way around. Yeah, looks pretty good. Now for this install, I am going to use the socket here. Voltar always does his NES RGB mods without the socket, and he'll just directly solder the NES RGB to the NES itself using the pins here. But in this case, I'm going to be using the socket. Now if you look at the board here, at where you uninstalled your PPU, you'll notice this little bump on one end of the PPU. That's actually going to match the socket here. That's the way we're gonna wanna line it up. And I'll flip it over. You're gonna have to hold it in place until you kind of solder it. Maybe I can get something to hold it in place. Gonna be drag soldering it, but I'm just gonna tack the corner in place. And then we'll do the opposite corner to tie it in. Now we're basically just gonna do the opposite of what we did earlier. Do some more drag soldering. There you go, all set. We're pretty much done with the back of the board, so let's flip it over. The next thing we have to do is attach these pin headers to the NES RGB board here. In order to do that, so let's see if we put these pin headers temporarily into the socket, and if we try to put the NES RGB on top of it, you can see how these capacitors down here are in the way. So we're gonna have to take them out and sort of do a bend with them and solder them back in place. Lucky for me, I still have my knife edge put in, so I'm gonna try to heat up both pads at the same time and wiggle these caps out a little bit. If you are doing a cap replacement, this would be a great time to do that because you can just install brand new capacitors with them bent over. Looks pretty good. Those caps are not in the way anymore. Go ahead and put these pins in the socket and then put the NES RGB over them. The holes you want to use are the one on this edge up here, so this set right here, and the top set down here. Let's go ahead and solder the corners because we're going to be drag soldering this as well. For this one, I'm going to do all 4 corners because these pin headers are separated. Okay, let's drag solder these all the way down here. Fortunately, I got some solder in these holes here, so I'm gonna have to go back with some solder braid and clean them out. Now we've got these pins soldered onto the NES RGB. It's time to do the PPU. It's important to know that you've got to line up the little nubbin with the nubbin here on the board, but you'll notice when you try to put the PPU on there that the PPU doesn't sit flat on this side here. So we're gonna have to go and cut flush all the pins on this side so that the PPU sits flatter down. Just use your side cutters, watch your eyes. Now the PPU should sit a little more flat in there. Let's flip it over and do our last bit of drag soldering. Go ahead and solder the corners of the PPU. Again, making sure that they're pressed down all the way. That's pretty much it. Now with that done, we can take the console and put our freshly soldered NES RGB in the socket. Now let's focus on the multi-out wiring. This is actually the 3rd time I'm going to film this section. My first 2 attempts, I realized that I had actually wired it completely upside down. So I'm going to give you some tips that will hopefully make this a little bit easier and try to help you with some of the problems that I had. Voltar has a stream about how to wire up this multi-out, and that's what I'm referencing, so I'm going to leave that in the video below. First things first, let's get an 8-wire piece of this ribbon cable, maybe 1.5 feet long. If you look at the outside of the multi-out, you'll see the notch where the multi-out kind of has a notch in it. That's going to be the top side of this PCB. If you pull the PCB out of the multi-out, you'll also see that the top part has this longer piece on the right side. And this is the side we're going to start on. While you're doing this, have the PCB pulled out of the multi-out a little bit, but not all the way out because you want to protect these gold pads here that the cable is going to connect to. Tuck those in a little bit so they're out of the way and that we don't get solder on them. I'm going to be using this bent soldering iron tip because as you can see, when you have solder on the end of it, it kind of pulls up in that spot where the tip bends. And I'll show you why this is important in a minute. One final note before we get started, make sure you use flux on all of these pads when you go to solder a new wire. After every wire, you want to add new flux. We're going to start with the audio wire, which is going to be the first wire in our cable. The left and right audio are going to be these first 2 holes on the far right. Since the NES only outputs mono, we're going to be bridging these left and right channels together. So first we're going to pre-tin it. Then you're going to strip a little bit extra off of this wire so that you have a pretty long exposed conductor there. Okay, then you can just go ahead and bridge these wires. The next wire is going to be for 5 volts and it's going to go into the next column but the top hole there. Now you'll be able to see why we're going to use that bent tip. So go ahead and put the conductor into the hole. Go ahead and put a little bit of flux on the bottom of the tip there. so that you have a little pool on there, and you're going to touch that little pool of solder to the via. That's going to solder the wire into that via. Okay, the next wire is going to be for ground. We're going to skip a column and we're going to bridge together the next two vias in the next column, sort of like we did with the audio. So go ahead and preach in the holes. And bridge both of those vias for the ground wire. The next wire is for blue, and it's going to go into the next column in the top hole. The last wire in the top side here is for green, and it's going to go in the next column in the top hole. Here's what the top side looks like when it's all finished. We have left and right audio, the 5 volts, ground, blue, and green. Let's go ahead and flip this over and solder the rest of the wires on the bottom side. The next wire here is for composite, and that's going to go in this via over here. Next wire is for C-Sync, and that's going to go in this via right there. And the last wire is for red, and it goes in this last via on the bottom right there. That's what the bottom looks like. That was composite, C-Sync, and red. Let's switch gears for a minute and cut the hole for the multi-out here in the back of the bottom case. The kit comes with this little guide thing, and it has notches in one of the ends, and that's the side that goes in the top here. This is basically to draw a hole in the back. So let's line it up so that when everything is in the back here, the wires and stuff are gonna go through this little space here. Doesn't have to be perfect. There you go. The drill bit that you're gonna need, Greg Collins says it's either a 5mm or I have a 13/64. I know that's really obscure drill bit. So we're gonna go ahead and drill some holes here in the corner. Guess we can kind of start slow. I'm lucky enough to have a Dremel, so I'm going to use that. Probably what I would do if I didn't have a Dremel is I would use the side cutters on these parts that are close together and drill a few more holes along the edge here, and then just use side cutters to cut the whole thing out. I'm just gonna use my side cutters on the sides here.
Now I'm going to start with my flat file here and just kind of file the rough bits down. Wow, that looks really good. Let's take the multi-out, stick it in the hole we just cut, and then you're gonna take the clippy piece and clip that multi-out into place. Then you can screw the PCB into place with the screw, and that's the multi-out. Now let's wire it up. Let's go back over to the NES, and we're gonna prepare the NES RGB for installing our wires. First thing, let's tin these signal wires. So we're gonna need audio output, audio A and B, ground, V, which is composite, R, G, and B, C-Sync, and 5 volts. While we're here, we're also going to do jumper J5, because this is a North American NES, and also J3, which is to provide power to the NES RGB board. Me from the future here, I think this is actually a bad idea. During my testing of this system without using this additional voltage regulator, I ended up seeing a game turn black and white. I don't know if that means it's actually overheating or whatever, but the heatsink 2, where the stock voltage regulator is, was getting super hot. So I think we are going to end up using this voltage regulator. In the footage going forward, you are going to see this jumper jumped here, but I'm actually going to reverse that. And later on, I'll show you how to wire up this additional voltage regulator. And also, we're not going to be using the palette selector switch here, so I'm going to be jumping this ground and 3 pad in the bottom. First bit of wiring we have to do is pin 1 and pin 2 on the CPU. Have to get soldered to A and B up here on the NES RGB. So let's pre-tin the CPU. And we'll just grab 2 wires from a short strip of ribbon cable. And we'll go ahead and solder these to pin 1 and 2 here. And now these wires are going to go to A and B. So pin 1 is going to go to pad A, and pin 2 is going to go to pad B. Now take your bottom case and kind of put it in front of the NES RGB. You're going to want to wire the NES RGB like this, because when you put it back in the case, you're going to kind of fold the wire over on itself like that. You're going to give yourself some slack on this ribbon cable, but not too much, because you want to be able to take this back apart once it's all together. So I'm going to cut a bit of the length off. We're going to start from this right side here. I'm going to sneak the audio wire under all these other wires. Solder it to O. The next wire is for 5 volts, and that's going to go to this pad over here. Next is ground, which is going to go over here. Next wire is going to go to blue, or B right here. Next wire is green, or G here. Next is composite, or V right here. Next is C-Sync, which is this one right here. And last but not least is red, which is right there. All right, that looks pretty good. If you didn't hear my little rant earlier, we're going to go ahead and desolder this jumper here, which is going to not supply the NES RGB with voltage from the NES itself. It's going to get its power from this little voltage regulator board. So we're going to run 2 wires from the voltage regulator, one from the unregulated pin and one from the ground, and that's going to go to this board. And then 2 more wires from this board, 5 volts and another ground, are going to run to the NES RGB board. I'm going to use a ribbon cable. I'm going to cut a 4-wire strand, and I'm going to make it a little bit long, even if we have to cut it short. If you look at the NES overall, this is actually the bottom of it, and there's the shield that goes over the top of it. We need this cable long enough so that it can reach both the voltage regulator and the NES RGB board about here. The additional regulator thing goes right about here on the bottom of the shell. So we're gonna make a cable long enough to reach both of those spots. Let's ditch the NES for a second, and let's tin the voltage regulator board and attach the wires to it. The wiring for this is gonna be kind of wonky because we're gonna end up splitting this wire inside of the console. So we want, for each pair of these 2 pairs of wires, we want one to be a ground and the other one to be one of the voltage lines. Mine ended up looking like this. So that is basically alternating between 5 volts ground and unregulated voltage and ground. And if we lay the board kind of like this, this is how you might plan your attack here, because the cable is going to go through the shield over in this corner over here. So go ahead and roughly line your board up, and I'm going to split mine in half, something like this. And then this pair is going to go off to the voltage regulator, and this pair is going to go off to the NES RGB. If we look at the existing voltage regulator from the front, the far left pin is that unregulated voltage pin, and this middle one here is the ground. Go ahead and wire your set of 2 wires from that board to the voltage regulator here. In my case, this yellow one is going to go to the unregulated pin, and the orange one is for the ground pin. All right, that looks pretty good. While we're here, we might as well check to make sure we didn't bridge these connections. Pretty good. Okay, now for this other set of wires, which is for the 5 volts. I'm gonna go ahead and take this existing 5-volt wire off of the NES RGB mod, and I'm gonna show you something underneath here. If you look on the NES RGB board, you'll see where it says 5 volts and ground. If you look a little further up, there's actually 2 vias for these points. So we're gonna go ahead and actually run this wire underneath the NES RGB board and solder them to those vias on the underside. So let's very carefully take the NES RGB board out. And before I completely remove it, I'm just going to route this wire here and cut it so that it's going to end up right about there. Okay, so for me, green is ground. Maybe we could even do both at the same time. Let's try to just tack these down. All right, that looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and put this back. I'm kind of routing this wire away from the pins over here. And let's go ahead and resolder our 5 volts for the multi-out. All right, now I think we can put everything back together and test it out.
When I first started the system, I thought there was a problem. My OSSC is set to line 4X mode by default, and I wasn't getting any picture through it. I always thought that the NES RGB 2.0 kits had dejitter installed, but it looks like it's not. It's the same problem where when you get into higher line modes, so line 3X, 4X, there could be some incompatibilities with certain monitors, and in my case, the OSSC. It seemed to be working fine in line 2X mode, even with Fireburn Nexus profiles, so I think the issue comes down to dejitter. I reached out to Tim Worthington in an email, and I asked him if the current firmware that ships with these NES RGBs had dejitter. He kind of clued me in that there are 2 problems with the NES video. The first is there's actually a missing pixel in the first line of the video, which the NES RGB 2.0 firmware actually does fix. It adds that pixel back. But then he said that there's still a sync problem on the first line of the NES that his NES RGB board does not fix. He actually recommended that I use a different scaler, or I could even install the dejitter mod from Video Game Perfection. So basically the NES RGB 2.0 does not fix the problems that people might have with an OSSC. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe. And if you have any questions about the mod or any other mods you'd like to see me do, leave them in a comment below. If you want more NES mods, check out this top loader that I did a no-cut NES RGB to. And check out my modding playlist for other console mods. I'll see you in the next video.